Hello. You can learn a lot about people of the past and the way they lived by looking at the things they used and left behind. I have here a number of things that you might find in an attic, a cupboard, a landfill, and we're going to look at some of them. But first, I'd like to talk about this. If I imagine that I'm an archaeologist or a historian of the future, and someone has brought to me this interesting object that the ancient Americans used, assuming I knew nothing about them, I could determine quite a few things about them. And I could look at this, and the process I'm going to use when I look at this and talk about this bottle is some of the ways I'd like us to think about the things I'm going to use from the past, whether we know what they're for or not. If I knew nothing about the people that used this bottle, I could look at it and say, is it made of a natural material or is it synthetic? Well, it's synthetic, it's plastic. Was it made by hand? No, it was made by a machine in a factory. Now, if I knew nothing about America, and I knew that we have a container here that was made out of a synthetic material in a factory, I know we're not dealing with a simple primitive people. We've got people with technology, probably cities, an organized society. Then if I later found out that it contained a beverage, something to drink that had really no nutritive value, we're just talking about flavored sugar water, and that they were able to take this, bottle it in this high-tech bottle, sell it, and then throw it out. I would know that we had a people with a fairly complicated culture that had quite a bit of money because they could afford to do this for something that wasn't a necessity in life, and probably didn't care very much about the consequences of some of their things because they threw the bottles away. So I could take this kind of a way of looking at objects and look at some of the things from the past and see if we can draw conclusions similar about the way people lived back then. The first thing I'd like to show you is this. This is a wooden bowl, and it's actually, well, let me just say, I'm talking mostly to adults here, but I frequently take these things and I talk to children. Now, children will look at these objects and they will know very little about a lot of these things. They can guess about some of them, but other objects, they have no idea what they are. I'm assuming that some of us will know what they are, although not everybody. But this bowl and the little ladle that goes with it were used for a very specific purpose. Let's look at the ladle. Now, the ladle is handmade, and the important part of the ladle is the back of the ladle. The ladle is smooth back here and rough here, so I know that this is the important part. It goes with the bowl. The bowl has been turned on a lathe, probably a hand power, probably not a machine lathe because the bowl is quite old. And you took the paddle and you rolled it around like this. And what was it used for? This is a butter bowl. It had a very specific purpose. People will guess a mixing bowl, a cereal bowl, a grinding bowl, but it's a butter bowl. After the butter was churned, the wet, sticky butter with it still had a lot of fluid in it, was placed in the bowl, and the water, the liquid, was worked out of the bowl and poured off, and worked again and poured off. So it was the outside of the paddle that was important, not the inside. It's not anything to drink out of. It's wood, and it's largely handmade, so it was made by a much simpler society with a simpler culture. And it's certainly not something that we would have to use in daily life today. Going with the butter bowl is this. Now, kids will say, oh, it's a decoration. It's something to put, something to put a teapot on. It's something to hang on the wall. Its actual purpose was used as a butter mold. And it's made largely by hand. Its dovetail joints are fitted together. And of course, you'd want to take it apart to clean it after you used it. Now, the children who have bought their butter from the grocery store don't really see the point until I tell them, well, all right, you take your butter out of the bowl, you have a lump of butter. What do you do with it? You can form it into a lump. You could roll it into a log, cut it in slices. Or if you wanted to be a little bit fancy, you could put a piece of butter into the mold, press down, and of course lift it up, and there you have a nice decorative piece of butter. An easy way of making a simple product to look a little bit better. Staying in the kitchen, we have another object that was given to us. Now, you know, the objects that the Historical Society collects have been given to us by people usually in the Dayton, Montgomery County area. And this particular very simple mallet-like thing was a potato masher. Now, if I ask the children to guess, I'll get dozens of answers as to what this might be used for. And of course, it could have been used for anything that has to be mashed or smashed or pounded. But this was used as a potato masher. And it still could be used as a potato masher. I don't know, with the cracks in it, we might not find it too sanitary. It'd be very hard to clean. But so we have a very simple potato masher. You could have used this 100 years ago. You could have used this 500 years ago. The very concept of a simple tool. But then we get to something a little more complicated. Now, many of you will have seen this. Many of you still have these. My family used one when I was a child, and we called it a potato ricer. It does say potato masher on the lid of it. But, of course, you put your cooked potatoes in, and then you pressed it down. The thing that's interesting about this is anybody could make one of these. All you need is a piece of wood, well, a little skill. But something like this is a completely different thing. This is an invention. Somebody had to come up with an idea. Somebody first had to decide that this wasn't good enough, that they wanted something different, something better. Well, why might you go to all the trouble to invent, manufacture, sell, buy, and use something like this? The main reason, of course, would be lumps. You don't get lumps with a potato ricer. Anything that's squished through the holes will be lump-free. But look at how complicated it is. We have a very complex curve on the lid. We have this thing here to keep the lid from banging, and then you have the little guide that keeps this part of the handle together so it won't get twisted. There's been a lot of thought and work gone into this. So somebody had to invent it, convince a manufacturer to make it, convince a store to sell it, and then convince people to buy it. And this is before the television commercials, which got us to go out and buy every gadget there was. So this was an example of a good invention that was used by a lot of people, and it solved the problem, or it was a little bit better than this. Staying in the kitchen, we have an example of what I think is a bad invention. You know, when I ask people who don't know, and that's most of us, what this was, people will say pancake turner, child spanker, gee, I don't know, you could hit a steak with it to smooth it out. The kids will come up with all kinds of ideas. I frankly thought this was some gadget that somebody came up with and didn't have much of a background for, and then I found it listed and pictured in a 1902 Sears catalog. So this was an idea that somebody convinced the manufacturer to make and market and sell. And what is it? Oh, what is it? It's a pot scrubber. So I guess if you had your stuck mashed potatoes, you'd put it in your bowl and you'd squish it around. I won't do it hard in my nice wooden bowl, but you could scrub your pots with it. I don't think this is a very good invention. And I don't think that people, I'm not sure how long it was used, but this is an invention that I don't think was a very good idea. Kids don't either. You know, as we stay working with kitchen and household technology, we have a bunch of things. For example, the egg beater. Now, you can still go out and buy an egg beater today. I have one. I use it all the time, and I think a lot of people do. I'm not sure that the food processor or the blender is much of an improvement over an egg beater for a lot of jobs. But this is something you could still use. It's the idea of an egg beater is still useful. A potato ricer, that's still useful. You'd want to use this. I'm not sure if I'd really want to mash my potatoes with a mallet. And that's the thing. Some of these things are still useful, could be used, and would still be, you know, pleasant to use and have a purpose. I'm glad I don't have to use this. Another object that a lot of us have seen, and I wish I had one, is the carpet beater or the rug beater. Now this is something I ask when I present this, particularly to children. Could you make one of these yourself? And the answer is yes. If you had wire and you held it and you twisted it together at the top and then bent it and twist it down here, this could have been made by someone at home or perhaps in a garage. You wouldn't have needed a major factory to do it. You certainly couldn't make one of these in a small family workshop, but you could make one of these. So something that's not handmade isn't necessarily machine-made in the sense of being made in a large major factory. You could have small industries or cottage industries. You don't have to have a real high technological sort of society to make this. Would you still use a carpet beater? Well, my answer is yes, because I have small throw rugs and I would. But the thing is, if you were talking to your children or your grandchildren about this, they don't see the purpose for this, because it really is an obsolete item in the sense that we have vacuum cleaners or carpet sweepers or even a broom. So if I were to say to the kids, well, why would you use this? And somebody says, oh, it's a carpet beater, Mrs. Bailey. I get this image from some of the children that you're out there hitting the carpet on the floor, and I say, now, do you think that would really help? And of course, the reason that we would use this is if you didn't have a vacuum cleaner, or if you had a big heavy carpet and you knew you weren't getting the dirt out of it, you could take the carpet out. So then we can go through a scenario of moving the dining room table, moving the chairs, rolling up the big dining room carpet, carrying it outside, hanging it on a clothesline. A clothesline. Many kids have never seen a clothesline. Then some bright child will say to me, well, if you hang a heavy carpet on a clothesline, won't the clothesline sag? And then immediately my mind goes, oh, well, clothes poles. When was the last time you saw a clothes pole holding up that clothesline so you could hang things on your clothesline? Then when you get the idea of the carpet outside and the fact that you're going to whack away at it with a rug beater, I get a lot of enthusiasm, particularly from children, because they can all relate to this as a good job. Before I tell them it's a carpet beater, by the way, a lot of them say, oh, could that be a pancake turner or a pizza turner or a child beater? And I have to reassure them and say, no, 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 not that. However, here's an object that every child recognizes this. Most of them have never seen one, but they know. But they don't know what it really was for. They all know that this is the strap or the strop, and they're all very aware that it could be used to discipline an unruly child. And in fact, when I take this program and talk to live groups, there's invariably many people in the audience that go, oh, I remember that. Well, then I'll say, well, what is this? What was it actually used for? And I have here a razor. This is a so-called tonsorial gem in its little original box. And we have here a straight razor. Now I can take this and pass this around to a group of adults, but I certainly wouldn't let the children get their hands on this. And I can talk about the razor and how people, I don't think too many people use them, although I do know barbers, and there are men that still use a straight razor. But of course you would sharpen your razor on the razor strap. I'm not going to do this because this is a very old example of this. Now a razor strap could be made anytime you had leather. This is glued together, two pieces of leather glued together. And that would be easily made and easily constructed. The razor, however, this is another product that you really need a fair amount of technology to come up with something like this. Obviously, razors have been around for hundreds of years, thousands maybe. This is a particular one. This was a machine-made one, and it was could be bought. You could buy these anywhere. I do have. This is just a page that came out of a 1901 Sears catalog, and it does show razor strops and razors and different ways of doing this. And I find for looking at things from the era, we're talking about the turn of the century, the old reprints of the Sears catalogs are really useful to get an idea of what things were and how they were used. And we do have razor strops up in here, and we could see some of the things that you might buy from the Sears catalog. Well, let's go. We've talked about what a man might use. We'll talk about what the lady might use. And this is a curling iron, and everyone can guess what the curling iron is. It doesn't look too much different from today's curling iron, except, of course, it's not electric. Now, immediately with the young people, it's what do you do, how do you heat the curling iron? And they think, well, you can put it in the fireplace. I said, well, it has wooden handles. Oh. Well, we could heat it on a stove, and that's true. I know people who've heated them on stoves, people who've put them into the chimney of an old-fashioned oil lamp and get the heat that way and have the handle sticking out. The photograph I'm showing is of a young lady taken around, we don't know who she is, by the way, taken around 1890, turn of the century, and she undoubtedly curled her hair with this kind of curling iron. Of course, what's wrong with this kind of a curling iron? How do you control the temperature? How do you be careful not to burn your hair or to have it the right temperature? Now, to me, this is an example of something that's truly obsolete in the fact that an electric curling iron really solves the problem. This leaves you with quite a bit of a problem. So I wouldn't want to have to use this one. I'm glad I don't. I have a number of other things that relate to different aspects of life. For example, we have a dead bird. Now this dead bird is a special dead bird in its own way. And if I turn it over, perhaps you can see it has hooks embedded into it. And this was designed to be worn on the brim of a large brimmed hat. And it would have been very smartly sitting here. And you could buy lovely stuffed birds from the Sears catalog or the Bloomingdale's catalog, or I'm sure locally, to go on the brim of your hat. That's one. Now, I'm glad that's an obsolete technique. Back to the house. Let's look at some ironing technology. And here we are again with something that ironing is no longer obsolete. We thought permanent press might make it obsolete, and then we're now back into rayon and silk and linen and this sort of thing. This iron is quite old and very crude, and it could have been made by a blacksmith or very simple foundry techniques. The bottom is still smooth, but the iron itself, as you can see, is very crude and very rough. It would have been heated in the earliest of days in a fire, put on the coals, and later on a stove. One problem, of course, would be that the handle would get hot, so you'd have to have some kind of a pad to put around, either a leather pad or a cotton pad to hold the iron. And of course, it doesn't stay hot very long, does it? And it's very hard to control the temperature, so you'd need more than one. And you could have as many as you want. The second iron I have here is a little bit newer. I have a trivet to put the iron on, but I have this iron here. Now, this particular iron is a Mrs. Potts sad iron, and evidently Mrs. Potts was the one who came up with the removable handle technique. And you just put your hand under here and you pull up and turn the handle, and the handle comes off. Of course, now you have something, and this is a true invention, and this is really an improvement, because you could have a number of the bottoms, which are cheap, heavy, but it's a very simple thing. It's just basically iron. You could have different shapes, different sizes, have them heating up on the stove. Your handle, which is the high-tech part, which has the moving parts here and is made of different materials, you only needed one. So when I was finished ironing, I'd been ironing away and my iron got cool. I'd put it on the stove, take the handle off, go get the next one that was been heating up, pop on the handle, and then I could iron. I've seen these sold as sets, as individual irons, but you could buy a set of several bottoms with one top. You can also, these are also listed in the Sears catalog. There are a lot of people that collect irons, and there are different kinds of irons to be found, and there are whole societies of whole iron collecting is a whole other sort of a thing, and of course there's lots of them around. Used as door stops, used as decorations, or just to collect. Now here's an object that very few people, unless they know, would ever guess what it was for. If it were slightly smaller, I would call it a sugar devil. When it's this size, it's basically a fruit auger. Now if I ask the kids about this, you can imagine the comments I get from the kids about something like this. I guess the best one is you would put it in the front yard and use it to tie your dog's leash to it. You dig it in. We have some rather gory suggestions that go along with this. But it's fairly simply made. The iron part could have been done by any blacksmith, and the handle, although this is a nice smooth turn handle, the handle could have been anything. A fruit auger. Now see, we've got something else that's truly an obsolete technology. There's no need for a fruit auger. And what does a fruit auger do? Well, let's imagine a barrel of raisins, apricots, some sort of dried fruit at the grocer, and you want to loosen up the fruit. You're not going to stick your hands in there. You're not going to stick a spoon in there, maybe a fork. But if you had a fruit auger, you just insert it into the sticky mass, turn it around, pull it out, and you've loosened up a fair amount of the stuff. Now, if you talk to a young person about this, the whole concept of why you'd need a fruit auger, okay, they can relate to the barrel, but the idea of going into a grocery store where you have a Cracker Barrel and you have a barrel of fruit, They've probably seen a barrel of pickles as a specialty item somewhere. But the concept that flour and sugar and various things would come in large quantities and you'd have to scoop them up and then wrap them up and tie the package with twine. The idea of packaging. So once you start with a simple tool, you can see how that just is a representative of a way that a whole way of shopping and doing things has changed so greatly that the whole system is different than it used to be. I have here a wood plane. Now this particular plane I don't think is terribly old. It's the style of it is a very, very simple, very basic style. And there we go. I'm left-handed, that's my problem. And it fits in the hand very well, and it can be used easily. Now, this is another subject when you get into the topic of tools. There are catalog of old tools and maybe not so old tools. But if you would pull the wooden wedge out of here, the metal blade is attached to a stem here, and you could adjust the wood plane. You could adjust the depth of the plane. Now, of course, many of the children, the concept of planing wood is something they've not thought of. So you can get the idea that a carpenter would still use this. Now, I'm sure that there are a number of these about, and they're all different kinds of planes, and this could still be used if it were sharpened. It's not in very good condition right now. But it's another example. This could have been made by anybody. I think this one was manufactured. It does have a company name stamped on the end of the wood. But this certainly could have been a handmade tool or a factory-made tool. You could have all different kinds of variations in it. Oh, well, I'm going to show you a fashion item. Now, here is an item that gets a great deal of response. It's fairly, I guess we should put the front first. It's fairly easily recognized as a bathing suit. However, I asked the children when I talked to them about this program, is this a man's bathing suit or a woman's bathing suit? Well, I'll get quite a look on this because the very fact that I ask a question that it might be a man's makes them stop and think. And some kids will know that men's bathing suits were often had a top or not. This is a woman's bathing suit. It's made of wool, has no lining, no bra, no underpinnings, no support. So if it got wet, it would be saggy and very heavy. It's quite heavy as it stands. But it's made of wool. I do have here a picture of a woman wearing a bathing suit, not too different from this one. And I do like her companion here in his nifty little striped outfit. I have a couple other pieces of clothing here. This is a vest. It's made of linen. And it was made by Joseph Yeska, a tailor in New York, and his label is sewn into it. And it was sold at Reich's. And it's not too obscure an item now because vests have been, of course, a big fashionable thing with teenagers for a couple of years. But it's very nicely made. It was sewn on. It's not hand sewn. It was machine sewn. But one of the things that's quite interesting on it, of course, in the light of nowadays, are the buttons, because the kids are all very aware that buttons are plastic, and these, of course, are not plastic. They're mother of pearl. And we can get into a whole discussion about where things come from. Where does the linen come from? Where does the wool come from? Where does silk come from? Where do buttons come from? Where does anything come from? Well, we have one more fashion item here. And this nifty little number has a rather small waist, but a rather large bottom. So it would give you a lot of room to move around, yet be very modest. This is not terribly old, but it's got a machine kind of a lace made on it, whereas this petticoat, which is also not terribly old, has machine tucking done along the sides here, so we know it was made after the mid-1800s, and it does have a nice border on it. You know, it's very interesting to look at things from the past, and we can go up into our own attics and find things ourselves. Anytime you can look at things and talk about the past, talk to your friends, talk to the children, tell them how things were, tell them how things were used, because you can learn an awful lot about the things you find in Grandma's attic. Is that